going to experience the hell we're going through. I thought, why not? I'll just
yeah. This is the auto version. This is Lebanon Tokyo Drift.
Exactly. I pride myself with professional microphones and a camera and a setup. Instead, I'm doing this in my car. Anyway,
we do what we can. My laptop is old and it doesn't have the greatest video anyway. So anyway, we are recording now, and so welcome everyone back to another episode of a podcast that we call Khalidiyya, because it's two guys named Khalid, and that's how we decided to name it. We have a special guest today, Ronnie Chattah. I met you like 11 years ago when I was living in Beirut, and you were doing the Walk Beirut. Do you still do the Walk Beirut tours?
I haven't given the tour since late 2019. Okay. That was the last time I did it, and for many reasons, one of which is the country has been through so much since October 2019. Things got very tricky, and shortly after that, coronavirus made it impossible to have big groups joining. And since then, things have been taking a downward spiral. So I don't think it's the right time to try to give a fair interpretation to the city, which I tried to do in the years before. So I'm going to wait a bit before doing it again.
Well, before I go, I want to continue introducing you, but I also wanted to introduce you to Khalid Sidafi, who is my...
I'm like sitting here, like I'm waiting for the introduction.
This is my compadre in this podcast. We were students together in the master's program at UCLA, and we've been this is our 7th episode now.
I think it's episode 8.
Is it 8?
I think it's 7 or 8. I'm not sure. But
hi,
Ronnie. Nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure, Khalid. Well, I'm glad. I assumed it had something to do with a name. I didn't know there were two, so that's it's good to know how these things happen. I assumed it was the other Khalid. It turns out
it's nice to have a story behind the name, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So Khalidin. So he was part of our whole cohort along with Golin, you know who you remember that I was living with in Beirut. Yes. But yeah, your walking tours were great, and I learned a lot. I still remember many of the stories. It was great because it was so historical that you would take us to different spots in Beirut, and between like Roman baths and the fact that Hamra was named after the red dirt, and also methods of that were used to counterfeit American dollars.
Yeah, very good memory.
I remember the stories that you told. So yeah, it's nice to talk to you. It's been a long time, and you're looking good.
I wish I was looking good. You're a very decent liar. I'm fat. I've expired, and you're seeing me in a car trying to charge a phone to make this happen. I'm in no good shape, but I appreciate it. You look good too.
I'll let you take whatever you want. I think you've aged better than I have in the last 11 years.
I don't know.
But yeah, we wanted to have you on and talk about what it is that's happening in Lebanon, and maybe start with a little background, like the last few years, and then get maybe a little bit more of a personal aspect. But like for those who don't know, like where the protests about the economy started before the this explosion and all of that, like maybe what's up in Lebanon.
Sure. So just to give you some context, and now I know how to work this properly, I'm going to open my car window and I will show you. So that's where I live. The entire building's facade was destroyed from the port blast that happened. If you can see just down the street behind those trees, is a section of the new port. So I live in a neighborhood called Maram Khayel, which was impacted tremendously by the port blast. And the reason I'm starting it this way, I mean, the port is really right here. And actually that's the view from my window when I'm upstairs. So the reason I'm starting it off in a somewhat somber note is because next week will be the 1-year anniversary of the port blast. And things have been rapidly deteriorating, not just since the port blast last year, but as you said, Khalid, earlier, the last 2 years have seen a very, very devastating toll to this country for a number of things that have happened, one of which is economics, which you hinted at earlier. I think when you visited, which by the way, you said 11 years, time goes by very quickly.
That was crazy. Yeah, it was 2010. It feels like yesterday.
So the money that you used 11 years ago was worth roughly the same amount up until almost 2 years ago. It was at 1,500 lira to the dollar, which was more or less a fixed rate, a managed float that was in place. Just a few days ago, it was at 25,000 lira to the dollar. So it lost over 90% of its value. So if you can imagine having money in your wallet that disappears in almost all of its value very quickly, that's become a reality here. The political situation is terrible. There has been no government. There's only been a caretaker government for a year. There's been no functioning government for a year, if not longer. That's been paralysis. And add to that, I mean, every country has had a tough time, 2020, 2021, with coronavirus. It took its toll here. There's a resurgent wave of this Delta deadly version. So the numbers have gone up significantly in the last few days. There's talk of a potential shutdown once again, lockdown. But that's the minor side. The major is that the country is ungovernable. And the port blast is not a normal, the term blast, I think, does not define it correctly. And I apologize if I'm fading with the sunset. I will turn on a light when needed.
It looks like you're all right.
I'm all right? Okay. If I ever need to turn that on, you let me know. Okay, good. The port blast is not a blast. It's the largest non-nuclear explosion in modern history.
No, it was insane. I saw the video.
It's insane. Yeah.
I haven't seen anything.
And it's ammonium nitrate, when in small amounts used for fertilizer, is one thing. There was 2,700 tons of it parked in the port for nearly 7 years. Most of it, not all of it, some of it was siphoned off. Most of it is now, part of Beirut. I mean, we all got impacted by it. And it's been a very, very, very bad time.
Yeah, but to sort of explain that a little bit deeper, like there were these tons of ammonium nitrate that was stored at the port. From what I've read, it was kind of improperly stored, and it was stored next to something that it was fireworks or something, that flammable materials next door, and the fire started next door, and that exploded the ammonium nitrate. That's what I read.
There was hazardous material in the same warehouse, which included fireworks, and included small scale weaponry, things that could catch on fire if heated to a certain degree, which is what happened. And yes, those smaller explosions led to a blast prior to the main blast. So there was a lot of hazardous material in that warehouse. But the ammonium nitrate was the reason why this whole thing happened.
Do you have a concept of or do you have a theory? Because I feel like there have been different stories told about that stock of ammonium nitrate. one story that I read was that it was sort of accidentally or misshipped or something like that. Do you have a concept of some group or part of the Lebanese government or or some group in Lebanon that was deliberately housing that?
No, the facts have been delivered. There's a cargo ship with Syrian businessmen, ties with the Syrian regime, and it was parked at Beirut's port, almost certainly at this point for warlike reasons, not fertilizer. Those investigations have been done. More recently, there's I think it's a French newspaper, Figaro, if I'm not mistaken, that had an in-depth discussion on the port blast. The conduits in Lebanon, one assumes that it's allies of the Syrian regime. It would be a very unusual situation if it was opponents of the. That's one obvious conclusion, and that's why that could point to the reason why we have not had an investigation. This type of enormous explosion requires something that is done in an international to international standards, not a sloppy domestic patching up investigation, which is what would happen if
Yeah, I
one was
heard it
done
the other
here.
day. There was a top general, a top Lebanese general who was basically prevented from, or he was given immunity from testifying about this.
There's been discussion for many, I mean, going back now since the blast on how to remove immunity from a number of people. These are politicians, these are intelligence officials. This is actually, if I'm not mistaken, you're referring to the head of general security, which was a few weeks ago. Yes. These discussions come and go. No immunity has been lifted as of yet. And actually, these are actually ongoing discussions even today. The former Prime Minister, Saad Hariri, who was in a caretaker capacity for 9 months, also now just saying that we should lift immunity. But it's a constant discussion. It hasn't gone anywhere.
Well, I think that is emblematic of what's going on in the country politically, just on a grander scale. Maybe we can talk a little bit about how things came to where they are. I know obviously this is like we don't want to get too far back into the history, but just to give our listeners some context.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sophie, you were in Lebanon more recently than I was, doing work with Syrian refugees.
Yeah, it was 2017, so it was a while, like not too long ago, but before any of all this stuff that like the recent events had happened.
Yeah.
This is the question. If you ask a number of Lebanese, you'll get a number of answers. And I think the easiest way to approach this from a subjective view is to focus in on the state's erosion for over half a century. And it's a word that is used here. I don't think it catches enough traction, but it's something fundamental, which is that Lebanon lost its sovereignty long ago, going back to 1970. And this country has been a battlefield for regional problems. Now, that is not the only problem that has impacted Lebanon, but that is a structural problem. And clearly in 2020, we're still paying a price for being part of a regional war. This time around, we're a weapons depot for a regime that is fighting for its survival next door. But those problems are old. It's a structural problem. So that, I think, is the fundamental background problem. Up front, and in at least recent years, it has been an economic situation that has its ties to the Syrian conflict next door. Lebanon did pay an economic price for having that conflict seep into Lebanon. It's also pure corruption. Lebanon is famous for its corruption levels, and that has been, thankfully, it's been addressed vocally, repeatedly by protesters in this country, and it's being taken seriously, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank or even sanctions. which have been applied on Lebanese officials due to corruption, not due to geopolitics per se, not the usual sanctioning that we hear. It's actual corruption, whether it's the Magnitsky Act, which is fairly new, or even taking an aggressive tone against corruption in Lebanon, which is good. Add to that, the Lebanese post-war system, and when I say post-war, I mean post-civil war, it functioned in a way that doesn't lend itself well to a post-civil war situation, meaning that many of the usual suspects are still in power. There is one militia, Hezbollah, that has survived 31 years of a post-war environment, and not just survived, it grew. And it grew to the point that it's a regional army. It's not a Lebanese local militia. So there's a situation there that's absurd for a post-war country trying to rebuild itself. And more, it's really the last few months is that the ungovernable situation has taken its toll. So institutions don't work. The state effectively collapsed. Now, I'll give you an example. Electricity is the most obvious one. There's no electricity. In the capital city, Beirut, if you're lucky, you get 4 hours of electricity now.
Only
so you have
4?
generators, only 4.
Even before this giant explosion, when in 2010 the electricity would go out for at least an hour per day.
Oh, it was going out for at least 3 hours per day after the Civil War ended. That was a good day if you got 21 hours of electricity. Yeah, but now it's reached the point that generators have replaced power plants. So, it's just a constant buzzing and humming of generators. So there's that side to the story, that the state doesn't work. Water supplies have reached critical levels. You get pumps to pump your water tanks. Pharmacies don't have
where?
Either it's private companies that mostly do it, and they're going to run out at some point too. But it's the generators. The water supply, the water plants require generators. Even internet outages have become frequent. Our local internet providers need to have generators running to actually power. And if you don't have power, you can't supply internet. And very recently is something very serious. There's no medicine. If you want basic medicine, and sorry for this sort of vulgar example, but diarrhea, I needed some anti-diarrhea medicine, out of stock. You can't get something basic. Imodium, something that you take for granted.
Yeah.
Or anything. Paracetamol is decreasing in supplies as well. So there's a serious societal breakdown happening. Add to that the currency fluctuation, which has killed the economy.
So we had an episode a few days ago about Syria and the current situation in Syria, and obviously Syria and Lebanon are have been very much interconnected politically and economically in very detrimental ways for Lebanon, for sure. But one of the things that we talked about was on a more grand scale, was looking at how politically, when Syria was like a vassal state of Iran, and we've seen the same thing with Iraq. We've seen the same thing with this political dominance that Hezbollah has in Lebanon. We also see with that comes a lot of failure when it comes to state functioning and corruption and militias popping up. At least in Lebanon, there's only one, but in Syria, Iraq, you see similar patterns, and so I wanted to get an idea from you also. Yes, different people in Lebanon may have different subjective opinions, of course, based on their political backgrounds or what have you. But it seems also that with the last couple of years, with the protests, with this breakdown of government, you're seeing a coalescing of sorts, especially of the youth in Lebanon. I'm not going to say all, but it's becoming more apparent that there is this recognition that there is this problem, this political problem, and this entity, Hezbollah, its loyalty isn't to Lebanon, it's to Iran. And so, and it's everything it does is for its own purposes and for Iran's purposes. So I wanted to get your opinions and thoughts on that too, especially with like the sense of what people are feeling on the street when it comes to that.
You've asked this question in such an eloquent way, and it's a great thing when a fellow podcaster is given all the terrain necessary to say the story as it is without loose ends. So I appreciate the way you framed the question, and it resonates. It resonates thoroughly. And it's quite obvious that you're in tune with what's happening, not just in Lebanon, but the region. I completely agree. This is a shared story. It has ripple effects. Last year, it wasn't just Lebanese protesting. Iraqis were protesting in full force. A violent crackdown on those protests in comparison to what happened in Lebanon. Many Iraqis killed, challenging a geopolitical quagmire. And Iran, in the last few days, but not just the last few days, regularly, in the last at least 11, 12 years, has Iranians are on the street demanding change. And I think it's just a few days ago, maybe just over the weekend, slogans coming out from Tehran saying, no to Lebanon, no to Gaza, which means implicitly stop funding groups that are hurting Iran's economy. It may not be for the same reason that we protest here, but it lines up geopolitically. So there is a structural paradigm that is under threat by inhabitants, local inhabitants, that may not express their desires in those ways. It may not be directly anti-Iran. You won't see necessarily anti-Iranian slogans or the flag itself being brought up, but it's economic. And when it's economic, dignity is at stake. When there's starvation, people will challenge any authority. And I think that has happened. These countries are suffering to the point that even a very, very long imposed disorder through Iran's proxies, primarily Hezbollah, but others as well, is eroding. Now, I don't think it will collapse in the near future. Those investments are decades old, but the grip has weakened. And you see an appetite, even among previous allies to that structure, you see an appetite for change. This could be, for example, just a small but important example. And I'm sorry to use these quasi-Orientalist ways of describing, but I don't know any better way to do this. Hezbollah strongholds, whatever that means. Parts of Lebanon where there is a Hezbollah security infrastructure, at least. You saw protests there. Now, they may not be anti-Hezbollah in nature, but they're anti the larger picture. So Hezbollah's role does come up. Whether or not they're crushed, whether or not that's intimidated, whether or not protesters are forced home is separate. The demands haven't changed. So there is a threat, at least, to this regional disorder that Lebanon is clearly a part of, but as is Syria, as is Iraq, to a lesser degree, and perhaps a more tragic degree, Yemen as well, and Gaza. Hamas is part of this story too. And populations have suffered too long. And I think this is why you see this erosion at a societal level having geopolitical implications. So you can't just you can't buy time. People have reached their limit.
On a technical note, I think it'd be a good time if you can turn on the light in your car.
Am I in the dark?
You're a little bit in the dark.
There I am.
We want to be able to see your lovely face.
I really apologize for this. Well, I mean, hopefully, some electricity
No,
will
no,
come
don't
back
worry.
soon.
Don't worry
Yeah.
about it. We understand, and we want our listeners to really know what's,
I mean, you're
what's
on
going
the
on. Like, this
Jabha.
is
You're on the front lines.
I'm on the
So,
front line of everything that's wrong.
of this
in Lebanon.
regional like
Yes.
disaster.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the I mean, the whole region is in kind of a disaster, and to have, I mean, the war with Yemen has been horrific. The war in Syria has been horrific. Egypt is a total crackdown police state. I mean, like from 2011 to now. 2011, for me, I thought it was a very hopeful moment that people were demanding their rights and saying, we've had enough of these corrupt governments. We've had enough of the corruption. We've had enough of like these military states that came about through coup d'etats, and we want governments that represent us and serve our needs. Where we have enough, like even in the 90s when Egypt was doing relatively well, the electricity and water would be shut off randomly at any time. You never know when. And the infrastructure is just like, there is no investment in infrastructure, and someone's always making money off of all of that, all of the resources, and people are making money, and at the same time the people don't have reliable power, they don't have reliable water, and it's not that the state doesn't have the money to pay for it, it's that the wrong people are taking the money. That's my impression.
I mean, you're probably so much better versed in what's been happening in Egypt than I'll ever be, and I won't even try to overstep here. I will maybe offer a step back, and
Sure.
I think there's a shared problem in this entire region, which is political violence dictates everything. There's no case in this part of the world where democracy is allowed to do its job, which is bad ideas are voted out, or if they're voted in, they're tested to make sure they're bad, and then they're thrown out. Good ideas hopefully win more than bad, and enough incentive for minorities to feel secure. That to me seems reasonable. Some of these countries have facades of it. Maybe Lebanon is one example where there's this veneer of democracy, yet that veneer is equally destroyed when it comes to violence. And when I say violence, I don't mean crime in that people are criminals towards each other. I mean political violence in that a regime or a militia can kill ideas. It's not killing, it's not civil war-like scenario. It's actually murder. Egypt is full of this. Iraq is full of it. Syria is full of it. Lebanon has had its fair share. And when it's not direct violence, even though this has happened on occasion, even in Tunisia, it's a tolerated situation where the state trumps the system in a way that's so unhealthy to society. So Tunisia, the last few days, it seems like a fait accompli that even Tunisia, that shining star of the Arab Spring, those expectations have their own limits, where political violence can, and still does, take charge of the story. So I think that is the sad conclusion of the Arab Spring, which is there was nothing to prevent murder and intimidation and violence from winning. This did not happen in other parts of the world nearly as much, whether it's Eastern Europe in post-1989, which had enough incentive to make do without that stuff, or even South America, Latin America, which found its way, and most parts of the world that have found their way. I mean, whether it's Southeast Asia, we're now the most difficult and challenged part of the world. But I think violence is the story.
Well,
If you're able to allow for the exchange of ideas without that threat, I think all these countries would be in a far better place in every single way possible.
I mean, I would say that sub-Saharan Africa is in a similar situation to the Middle East, in terms of irascible conflicts that just never end. And I would.
I'll interject one last thing before I sorry to interrupt. I mean, Syria, whatever you want to call that conflict, war, revolution, whatever.
Yeah.
The fact is, millions of Syrians are displaced. Perhaps hundreds of thousands are murdered, and half of Lebanon is potentially either Syrian refugees or Palestinian refugees. That, accepted as part of the story, is that you take it for what it is, that we're living this part of the world, that has permanent scarring. When you can't challenge your leadership peacefully, and now we have one of the most horrendous, atrocious leaders who survived so much, still running Syria and still capable of running Syria. That says it all. It says that if you do try still, even now, to try to win the right way, overwhelming likelihood you'll get killed while you're trying.
Sure.
I will say one thing about sub-Saharan Africa, just really quick, is that obviously it's a giant region, so it depends on country by country, but as a whole, I would say that if we're talking economically, there are some cases in sub-Saharan Africa where countries are slowly inching forward and coming together, at least economically. People talk about this future that Africa has, that it seems that that part of the world has even surpassed the Middle East. Like the Middle East is so far behind and has just become in such a huge mess.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think you're wrong there. I think there is more of a light at the end of the tunnel politically for a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But I would say, I mean, and Africa and the Middle East have so many resources, natural resources and sources of wealth that could be utilized to serve the populations. So I think the question to be asked, and it's a question that's usually answered in a very racist kind of a way, is why is it that these regions aren't prosperous like European countries that are that have far less resources but are actually prosperous? I think there's usually a very racist answer to that. And would you like to comment on that?
I don't know. No, I don't know what the racist reference is, but I'll say it in a different way. The further back in time you go in this part of the world, the richer it is in everything.
Yeah.
The richer it is in sorry to use this word, but culture is a very cosmopolitan part of the world. It once was among the most cosmopolitan. And this is real cosmopolitanism, not the flimsy type that people talk about. It's real. You have diversity of everything, and languages are spoken. Fundamentalists live next to secularists, and Europeans come to this part of the world to work. And add to that a real healthy exchange of communities that don't always see eye to eye, but live side by side. And an intersection that you want. There's a reason for it, and it makes sense geographically and historically. So there's a mosaic that's magnificent, and it's all but gone today. And I think I know where the question's going. There are parts of this region that are very rich, whether it's the UAE or Saudi Arabia, or Kuwait, Qatar, or even for that matter, Iran. that have resources, have money to spend, but that's an abnormal wealth of oil and oil money that doesn't exist in other parts of the world. Clearly doesn't exist in Lebanon. All the banks that once operated here, the 90 banks that were once here, their investors are gone. The money and the talent, the education, we had the most impressive university in this part of the world. American University of Beirut ranks lower and lower every year, almost shut down last year. This is a unfortunate flight to oil producing countries. But even then, whether it's the UAE with its very strange setup in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, or whether it's Saudi Arabia, with its vicious form of theocracy, or even for that matter, Iran, which spends almost all of its money on regional war, that money is not spent the right way.
Yeah.
So we have wealth, but it chased oil. The real wealth, the real richness of this part of the world is gone. I mean, these cities don't look or feel or even, they're not the same. I mean, Alexandria in Egypt, Beirut in Lebanon, sorry to include Turkey here, but I'll include it. Smyrna and Izmir, these places are not what they used to be. And that's a 20th century story. Except Beirut somehow, even after civil war, even after repeated invasion, Israeli invasion or Syrian invasion and occupation, up until the port blast, even with economic dysfunction, we still prided ourselves as being the last bastion, which is why many people would flock here. And I'm going to include you, Khalid. You didn't have to be here, but you chose to be here. I'm guessing you wanted to come here because there's an enchantment to visiting this city. That's gone. And that's a very sad ending to this city because it had that. And people use this word repeatedly, resilience. That's what they were talking about. It was a resilient city, but it doesn't feel that way anymore. So I think, unfortunately, Lebanon has joined the club.
Well, to get into a little bit of history, if I may, since you brought up the history so beautifully, and I think it's important for people to know that we have a rich history, and that this is something that we should know and fall back on, to know also what our future may look like as well. In terms of resources, yes, in terms of like what we're calling like hard resources, let's say oil and gas, if we're talking about the Gulf states or Iran, what have you, sure. But if we go back in time and we look at let's say the Levant area, or Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, those areas that were not rich in natural resources, but they were rich in people. Like the people were like, it's the human resources, I think, that made that area shine, in that if you didn't have the wealth of other parts of the world, you had commerce, you had trade, you had the exchange of, as you put it, cultures, the intermixing of cultures, and where all these different civilizations met would produce something beautiful, and it did. And so, unfortunately, with war, as we see now, and we've seen in the past, people flee, and that creates a brain drain in those areas, and it's a huge loss. However, if we also look at the history of our region, it's survived a lot of war and a lot of conflict, a lot of invasions, and somehow it comes back at some point. People are able to eventually come together and make something out of what remained. And so, that might, I don't know how long that might take, if that'll be in our lifetimes or not, but we for people who think that this region is just utter devastation and chaos and destruction, and it's always been that way, know that that's not the case, right? And that the people have the capacity. I know that when I mean, my family's Syrian. I grew up in Syria, and I heard the same thing about Lebanon as well after the civil war. When you have a conflict like that, you have a lot of people who become expats or refugees who flee, but they have so much desire to come back. And when things settle down, a lot of them do, and they do good things. I mean, you want the right sort of environment, you want the right uh, political system to accommodate that, of course. That comes before anything else. And I think that was where, as you mentioned, there was a big mistake in the post-Civil War period in Lebanon.
I completely agree. And I think Syria is the most striking example where a population is forced into something that is so miserable, where half the population is displaced or is out of the country, where too many decent people are killed, challenging the worst form of autocracy. And when they are given that chance today to go home, they're going home to something that did the same thing. It's a very difficult decision. Can you return when things have gotten worse and the same crowd is still ruling? I think that is an ultimate red line for the decent people that fled but should come back. Because who would want to? If you're out and those people are still around, you don't want to return. This is what makes our part of the world, I think, strikingly different. I'll give you an example. Hundreds of thousands of Bosnians were forced to flee, whether it's Sarajevo or Mostar or anywhere in Bosnia. Many Croatians, many Serbians too, forced out. They may not be coming back to the version that they dreamed of. It may not be the most decent form of accountability. It may not be the most peaceful situation, but they're returning, and this is 25 years later, they're returning, whether it's in Germany or in America or Australia, to a country that they believe in and one that is getting better and better. Whether it's through EU accession, whether it's through economic prosperity, or whether it's even through the guarantee that those murderers were held to account, at least up to a point. This could be Ratko Mladic or Karadzic, paramilitary leaders responsible for genocide. Even when their posters are put up now, they're taken down. So there's an assurance that there's no impunity. This word, I think we don't even consider it in this part of the world. Take it as it is. Impunity is part of the story, which it shouldn't be. So there's no paying a price for being a criminal in this part of the world. I think if one day we have that, if these types of criminals are held to account, at least to a point, I think you would see the description that you laid out, which is, why would you want to be in California when you're from one of the most beautiful countries in the world? Why would the other Khalid want to be in, is it Los Angeles where you guys are?
Yeah.
I'm guessing. Okay, I mean, Los Angeles, fine. Traffic, yeah, it's terrible in Cairo too, but Cairo, not too long ago, would trounce Los Angeles. And that's not the case
true.
Right now.
I mean,
yeah,
we hands down.
1980s, like, you know what I mean? Like
exactly.
The 80s and 90s trashed Cairo, and part of it was neoliberal reforms to the economy that brought in like foreign investors that basically just enriched a small amount of the population and kind of trash. There's a lot of stuff to talk, you know, in terms of like how populations, you know.
But it's so bad, Khalid. It's so bad that your reference point is the 1980s, which are the good days, which are still pretty bad compared to the shining star Cairo once was.
Yeah, in the 1960s, you know.
Yeah. But this is something that I think it makes no sense why those that love this part of the world the most are not here. Yeah. But if you put the word impunity in there, well, meaning there's no accountability, you'd want to be in yeah, sorry.
Well, I mean, like, it's very interesting that you brought up Serbia and the Bosnian conflict, because the Serbian military leaders are some of the only people that have actually been convicted in the international court ever. Like, no one, the international law doesn't, like, it's very hard to prosecute. And Serbians are some of the only people where they actually successfully prosecuted some of these people.
I think
And
that
I
was
think we
like
need to keep
an
that up.
example of, like, let's give some sort of legitimacy to this court. So let's just go after the Serbians. But yeah, no, I agree
In
with
the
what you're
international,
saying.
we need to beef up the International Criminal Court, because we saw a successful prosecution of war criminals. But pretty much the only place that's really happened is with Serbians from 25 years ago. And so it basically, it takes, like, a quarter of a lifetime to get to a point of justice.
Yes, and it also takes a deliberate effort by players that have leverage to unplug hotspots from geopolitical nightmare.
Yeah.
Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, even Kosovo have nothing to worry about, at least for the time being. We deserve this type of architecture. I mean, the amount of bloodshed by Qaddafi, by Assad, or by any despot, Saddam, we deserve something much more elaborate than the ICTY of Yugoslavia. We didn't get that. There's one example only, a very small one. It's the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which indicted one person, one Hezbollah operative who's named. The Lebanese state will never be able to deliver that name, deliver that individual to The Hague. Add to that, in a case of what was meant to be trial in absentia, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon suspended itself and has shut down due to budgetary constraints. So even then, this one example is gone. That will definitely dampen anyone's expectation for an international investigation into the port blast, or a tribunal for the port blast, or a tribunal for Assad's crimes, or a tribunal period. So that I agree with you that yes, the ICTY perhaps didn't do enough. But the fact is, people that were in jail died, or they're in jail permanently, life sentences. And if they died either natural causes or they committed suicide. Milosevic died from, I think, if I remember correctly, a stroke. The Bosnian Croat leader, his name escapes me now, paramilitary leader, he killed himself on TV, drank cyanide, drank something.
I remember that.
And Mladic and Karadzic will never come out of jail. Why don't we have something at least at that level? More people have died here, more countries have suffered. You need international assistance in that stuff. No international assistance in telling our part of the world. Yeah, sorry, just one thing. There's no needed recommendation on countries in this part of the world on how exactly they govern themselves, or what exactly sectarianism means to them, or for that matter, what mosaic and minority rights end up looking like. That's what everyone in this part of the world has to figure out on their own. That also includes accountability, reform, anti-corruption. We have to figure that stuff out. But ending violence at the regional level, we can't do it on our own. It's impossible. Neither could the Bosnians, and neither could the Croats or the Serbs.
True. No, you're not wrong. But I would add an addendum to that, in that the Middle East has too much international assistance. And by that, I mean international interference. Too many powers are fighting out their, world chess game in the Middle East. And so the Middle East becomes the battleground. Like Syria, what region, like what is the reason that Russia is interested in Syria? It's a part of an international chess game for Russia. You know, why is China like trying to get in on like, well, we want contracts for reconstruction? It's an international game of interference, and there's too many between the US, between the EU, Russia, China, Iran, fighting out their battles with each other in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. And it's, you know, I mean, you're destroying countries because they know if they went to like head-on war with each other, it would be devastating for both countries. So it's like, let's just destroy this country that we don't care as much about.
Well,
That's the situation that was avoided. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ronnie, please.
No, and by the way, I should apologize. Even somebody that was meant to be upstairs with me is now at the car too. So she was sitting here, and I'll introduce her. Here she is.
All right, yeah.
The more the merrier.
Sit down.
Welcome.
We'll have a party.
She's a journalist in Lebanon.
Ahlan.
She could do a better job. Here, I'm gonna give one of these to her.
Yeah.
Here. Take it. See, this is the episode you get a car and an extra guest.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Sorry for the mess.
Well, you have to give her a proper introduction.
She is Tala Ramadan. She's a journalist at Lorient Today.
Hello.
Very cool. Welcome.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, we're glad to have
party.
you.
I like how this is working.
No electricity.
I think we should always do it from cars now.
Maybe that's the way to do it.
Yeah, maybe I'd like in solidarity. I'd go and sit in my car.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would have been great, actually. Yeah.
If I had a car, I'd sit.
By the way, is it the 40-minute marker? Isn't it coming up?
Actually, I got a message. It said that they suspended the 40-minute thing. So as long as it doesn't shut off.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, great.
If it shuts off, we'll know.
Okay, excellent. So, sorry, I the last part of the question, I interrupted you guys.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I mean, and I think maybe you have the added feature of somebody who may disagree. Maybe, I think that is the one key ingredient that we need. I think everything else we're capable of doing, and I agree with Khalid. Yeah, there's no need to keep assisting for the sake of it if that assistance doesn't get you to a better place. I completely agree. And interference for the wrong reasons you want to avoid altogether.
Yeah.
But the architecture that can neutralize war from this part of the world, I think we're in desperate need. And if those tools were available here, I wouldn't say that. But the Lebanese, and I'm going to make it a very local example, the Lebanese cannot inspect their port. The Lebanese state cannot turn away weapons-grade ammonium nitrate. The Lebanese regime is incapable of dislodging this state from a battlefield situation. So that's something that Lebanese cannot do. That's the kind of stuff that you need some international leverage, not for the wrong reasons, but for the right reasons.
Yeah, not military interference, but assistance and aid.
Just like the Americans and the Soviets did not fight each other in Austria. They agreed to leave Austria alone. Austria's constitution, people don't care about it because it's such a boring story, but it's boring for the right reasons.
Yeah,
it's called the Treaty of
Switzerland.
But Switzerland, exactly. Switzerland is self-imposed. Austria could have been a country torn apart by the Cold War. Austria could have had the same fate as Germany, could have been divided, but it wasn't. The Americans and the Soviets agreed to leave that country out of regional war. It's called the Treaty of Neutrality, and it kept Austria out of the Cold War. And Austria is that one country, if you look at a map of the Iron Wall, Austria seems to be more Iron Wall geographically than the Czech Republic. It's further east in areas, yet it was a neutral country. Finland had the same situation. guaranteed to not be part of regional war. These are European examples. The Balkans post 1995 have an international arrangement that ensures it. And I'll make it even more relevant. There's household names that we remember as kids, we don't think of anymore. The IRA is no longer part of anyone's story. The Irish Republican Army was disarmed. Not disarmed by the Northern Irish inhabitants making that happen. It's the Good Friday Accords. That's an international agreement that ensures that this will never happen again. Democracy will. Sinn Féin is the goal. Hezbollah's Sinn Féin recreation is the goal too. Not to get rid of it, not to make it, but to make it part of your future, not holding on to the worst aspects of its past.
However, not to like, you're right, except for the fact that Brexit, there is a looming specter that we're going to have Northern Irish resistance. If you have a hard border between the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland, there was already, I think it was early 2000 or late 2018 or early 2019, there was an explosion, some terrorist attack. The Irish situation could become a situation again as a result of Brexit, because it's going to make a hard border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland.
Those examples aside, the rare occasions that one attack, and for that matter, the one attack in Sarajevo in recent decades, those exceptions aside, the chances of it spilling out of control into chaos and uncertainty again is very slim to none.
Yeah, I don't think many people in Northern Ireland want a return. Like like you might see an event like that. Like Ronnie said, it's an exception or exceptional. But the thing is, I think that once a people have had peace and stability after seeing so much conflict and bloodshed, it's very hard to get them to go back to that, unless the political system just falls apart and doesn't allow for that stability to continue.
It depends on how Brexit plays out.
Right, but even with Brexit, it's like, all right, you know, it's a terrible upheaval, I guess, if you want to call it, or shift,
or a mentally retarded kind of.
Yeah, but you know what? Move. But you know what? That's, I mean, going back to what we were saying about democracy, it's an idea. It's being tested. It might be reversed one day. Who knows? But I think that people prefer the peaceful route of dealing with these problems rather than resorting to violence.
It's that neither of the countries that have experienced repercussions or have been directly involved, whether it's the UK or on the other side, the Republic of Ireland, they have no leverage anymore, and they cannot contribute in a negative way to the future of Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland inhabitants that once supported the IRA will not support the IRA again in the way that they understood it before. They have a politics that is largely peaceful, not entirely, and I don't think there's any example of a purely peaceful form of the politics that we desire, but they're closer to there than we are. And that's Northern Ireland, and that's technically United Kingdom. So that's a very clean example. Even in the ones that were far more violent, they're figuring their way forward. And ETA in Basque, northern Spain, is gone. The Basque population is not seeking violence or supporting it anymore either. Colombia, this famed FARC guerrilla force, is on its way out gradually, but not to the detriment of, it's not something that is being violently pushed against where you're going to have a massive upswell against it. It's a politics that is fairly moderate and seems to be working.
they seem to be fatigued, and they're not being militarily eradicated, but they seem to be fatigued with conflict. And I think most populations in the world, if you give them the choice of a peaceful solution, they'll take it. I would take this moment to hear from our new pop-in guest.
Hello. I feel like I'm an intruder, so I'm trying to.
You're not an intruder. You're a welcome guest.
No, please feel free.
Everyone's welcome. You're a welcome guest.
And now for the actual intelligence and the sophistication.
Yeah, we need. Hey, I mean, it's been all dudes, so it's nice to have a female voice involved also. So if we can, if you have some things to say about international conflict in Lebanon, we are willing to listen.
I mean, I'm sure, no, Ronnie said it all best. Like, I agree with the fact that he said that we need this kind of intervention from abroad when it comes to investigations, because we cannot do it alone. And like, just when we talk about the international community and the international world looking at Lebanon, and we just hear people saying, why aren't people doing anything? Actually, people are trying to do a lot of things, and they're trying to, raise their voices and amplify the needs, but we cannot do it all alone. So I really feel like we need to have our voices amplified by the international community. I don't know if you agree, but I really feel like this is an urgent need for like this kind of intervention on all levels. So
how would you envision this intervention? Like, what kind of intervention would you think would be the best?
Like, in terms of investigations, especially for the blast, trying to move things even further, faster, because it's gonna take us ages if we're gonna do it all alone. So if you want to have this magnified scope on intervention, I feel like it's going to be exclusively maybe on the investigations.
So, like,
if I may,
like an international tribunal.
Yes, but something that actually targets people, and something that really pulls off this entity that's trying to take over.
So if I can jump in and share my opinion, I agree with the ideas that everyone is saying. The idea of international assistance, the right kind of international intervention. But if we're going to be, and I don't mean to be negative, I really don't, but if we're going to be, in my opinion, practical and seeing just how the international community has viewed the Middle East region, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's other parts of the region, like, the history doesn't show any real goodwill or any examples of positive intervention, if you want to call it that. And so to go back into the history a little bit, I think that the reason why that is because, and we talked about this on a previous episode, is and when we say the international community, we're really talking about the West, because that is the region that's the part of the world that our region looks to for solutions, for guidance, and I think a lot of parts of the world, not just the Middle East,
because they have all the money.
Right, they have all the power, they have all the money, right, and they in a lot of ways set the region up for a lot of its problems. But I think that's the key thing, is that what is the international community's or the West's intentions towards that part of the world? And like I said before, we talked about this in a previous episode, that we look at European colonialism and we look at imperialism, and we see that now we're just living a neo form of that. And what that means, wholesale warfare countries being destroyed, resources being extracted and stolen from these countries, and societies being torn apart. And so, in my opinion, it's kind of a lost cause to think that we can really get any positive intervention or any sort of positive intention from the West when it comes to our part of the world. And I think that when we look at other regions, so you guys brought up some really good examples, whether it's Bosnia, Serbia, and the Balkans, or Ireland. Yeah, I mean, these are areas that saw really intense conflict for long periods of time. But at some point, they were left alone. It's like, all right, we want to see an end to this conflict. It's gone on for too long. The people in this conflict have hurt each other enough. It doesn't suit them or the wider international community for this conflict to continue. However, and so they'll go on and they'll push for and support a diplomatic and political solution. In our part of the world, conflict is the norm. Conflict is what the international community desires, whether it's for, again, the destruction of countries, the tearing apart of societies, whether it's for the sale of weapons on a large scale, whether we're talking about reconstructing countries. And you brought up a good question about why Russia was being involved in Syria. The other day, the Russian foreign minister said that they had tested 320 different kinds of weapons in Syria.
Yeah.
So it's a testing ground for mass destruction. And so to go on a little bit, just to talk about also what we as a people think about, like how we view ourselves and how we view the idea of resolving our problems that are in some ways imposed from the outside, in my opinion, but these systems have been pushed so that this corruption and these problems continue to fester, and these tyrants and dictators in a lot of these countries do get a lot of support from the West. Tunisia was brought up. Tunisia was that great example of, all right, one country that may have been somewhat of a success after the Arab Spring. Yet with what happened a few days ago, the West is like, all right, well, it is what it is. It's like they want to see it fail, right?
Well,
and so
I completely agree, and I'll just interject here. You want anyone with leverage. Forget the countries that have no say. Any countries with leverage in malignant ways or in beneficial ways when they want to. You want them to err on the right side of history. You don't want them to prolong problems, whether it's accepting abnormal regimes and using their leverage in the region for what they deem to be good things on their terms. That's the story of our times. Bashar al-Assad negotiating or even having a CIA liaison with that regime is a disastrous situation. Expecting Iran to do dirty work on America's behalf as well, whether that's anti-Al-Qaeda stuff, or even for that matter, using the Iranians for reasons that only serve limited American goals, that has a very huge toll on this part of the world. Add to that, at times supporting Saddam and his war against Iran, and then fighting Saddam and turning Saddam into the story. These are the things that should be over with. Right now in Lebanon, there's a real fear that the Syrian regime, because it was preserved, will have leverage again in Lebanon. The Syrian regime will have influence that it lost, that Hezbollah took in its place, that the Syrians will now take back. If the Americans, for example, are to say, well, that worked for us for 15 years, that took Lebanon off our minds, it pacified the situation. We can accept that. You'll see a Lebanon that even further erodes. So that's the stuff you want to see over with. Security concerns, as opposed to championing moderates and Democrats that really want the same things Americans or Westerners take for granted. So that's the stuff that should be incorporated. All the other things I agree with. Yeah, you don't want the bad version of imperialism. You don't want the stuff that has damaged this part of the world. And you don't want it to be only about security. Security does have there are reasons to have that on the agenda, but not when it perverts and destroys a region and makes things more insecure. And you don't want any refugees.
I think
yeah.
Like, honestly, I think the type of Western intervention in the Middle East, if we're talking about Western intervention in the Middle East, what the region needs is mediation, which comes in the best form, comes from like the Nordic countries, because they just really have no stake in the thing. They have no dog in the race. And they're just like, you get like Sweden and Norway to mediate, to help out, and sort of an effort to invest in the things that in rebuilding and that kind of thing. Like there's a lot of rebuilding that needs to happen. And
I agree.
You know what I mean? You're not going to get aid for rebuilding from the Gulf countries unless you ideologically align yourselves with what they want. So you need, an impartial mediator. That's what needs to happen, is impartial mediators. You don't want people that have America has way too much interest in the region, partially because the value of the dollar is tied to the price of oil. So, there's no way that America can ever be impartial. And also their strong connection to Israel, they will never be impartial in the region. So you need some impartial, China sort of dangles the idea of being ideologically impartial, but also they I don't trust them in the long run. It seems like they're playing a long game of world domination.
You want countries with leverage to do the right thing, which is a rare occurrence.
Yeah.
One selling point is this part of the world has given everyone a headache.
Yeah.
And it has changed politics for the worse in many countries that are not in the region. It has made leaders overly concerned, and even some of them waste political capital, including Macron, who showed up here the day after the blast and I think felt humiliated a month later. So you want all of these things to line up. And I agree with Khalid, the other Khalid. Nothing seems to be pointing in that direction, unfortunately.
No.
On that note, though, I actually have to get my ass ready because I have another interview, which I'm a bit late to. I should have logged in right now. Yeah, but it's okay. I have Tala messaging saying that I'm running a bit late. So I unfortunately have to end. I never do this out of principle, but at 9 o'clock I have another podcast. So
well,
I hope.
Okay, but before we leave, plug your podcast, because you have a very successful podcast going.
So it's called the Beirut Banyan, and it's at 270 episodes. Most of them are discussions surrounding particular topics, and most of them are Beirut focused, but not all of them. There are some storytelling episodes that are more they resemble better the tour that you went on, Khalid, in that it's sort of trying to share the city's history in a different way through storytelling. And I also write a weekly column for an outlet called Now Lebanon. A new piece came out today. Tala Ramadan is the hero of the moment. She's probably one of the most well-known Lebanese journalists on the scene. which is true.
Yes.
She's a bit embarrassed by me saying that.
Where
So I'll plug her as well.
Where does her work show up? Where would you
I
find
work
that?
at Lorient today.
Lebanon today?
Lorient today.
Well,
Lorient, okay.
It's
Lorient
a
today.
local publication. Yeah.
All right.
And,
Well, we're
Okay.
very lucky to have you.
Thank you guys.
And
I appreciate this.
send us links to all your stuff, and we'll post it on our page, and we'll share.
We'll do.
And we should have you again soon sometime just to catch up and
I'd be
continue
honored.
the conversation.
And I promise you next time it'll be an apartment with electricity.
I mean,
no, this was great.
This
was great.
was too long to be a one-part thing. This has to be a part of a series. So,
yeah, so next
we
time,
definitely need
actually,
to get
you know
you on
what?
again.
The chances of there being electricity are so small. I'll take you to the Corniche next time. It'll just be an outdoor with a little tripod.
Nice.
Thank you, guys.
Okay,
Thank you.
This
Thank
has
you
been a
so
great
much.
conversation. Thanks a lot for being on here, both of you.
Thank you, Khalid.
You guys
Thank
have a
you.
good night.
Much love.
You too.
Have
Bye,
a good
guys.
night.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.